One false accusation at the airport changed everything, as a black traveler quietly walked through the terminal, unaware that powerful eyes were already locked on him. Planning his downfall, and in a single moment the manager's voice thundered across the hall accusing him of carrying drugs. A cruel lie that spread like fire through the crowd, whispers turning into judgment. And in that chaos the traveler was dragged into humiliation. Treated as a criminal while the manager stood tall enjoying his false victory. But what the crowd saw as weakness in the traveler's silence was actually the beginning of a storm, because hidden beneath that calm face was a truth no one could imagine. A truth that would flip the balance of power in a single breath. For this was not just a random passenger, but the very man sent to test the system. And his revenge would shake the airport to its core. It was a regular day at the airport where the sound of rolling suitcases mixed with constant announcements and hurried footsteps. Passengers rushed to their gates. Families said quick goodbyes, and security officers kept their sharp eyes on every corner. But in the middle of this busy scene walked a man who looked ordinary, silent and almost invisible to those around him. He carried himself with calmness, no sign of fear or guilt on his face. Yet destiny had marked him for something darker, because while others moved freely through the terminal, a single powerful figure had already chosen him as prey. The airport manager, proud of his position and blinded by arrogance, studied the traveler with a cold smile, and in that instant, a cruel game of framing an innocent man began, a game that would soon expose deep injustice, hidden power, and a twist no one inside that airport was ready to face. The airport manager stood near the security line, his sharp eyes scanning the sea of passengers. But when they landed on the calm traveler from before, something inside him twisted into malice. For this was not about routine duty or responsibility. This was about feeding his ego, proving his control, and showing the crowd that his authority could never be questioned. He had built his reputation on arrogance, a man who thought no one could touch him. And in that moment he decided that the silent traveler would become his next victim. Judged not by actions but by appearance, by prejudice hidden under a polished uniform, so he whispered instructions to his staff with the ease of a man who had staged many scenes before. And while the traveler adjusted his steps, unaware of the trap forming around him, the manager's smirk grew wider, his mind already painting the picture of public humiliation. A scene where he would stand as the hero who uncovered crime, while the innocent would be dragged through shame. The crowd would clap, the security would salute, and he would once again taste the power he craved. But beneath his confidence there lingered a dangerous truth, because this time his victim was not ordinary. Yet his arrogance blinded him from sensing that danger. He only saw what he wanted to see, a target easy to crush, a man too quiet to resist. And in that blindness he tightened the noose of injustice around the traveler, instructing officers to prepare a staged discovery, arranging every move so carefully that not a single witness would suspect foul play. And as he watched the crowd flow like a restless tide around the terminal, he imagined the look of fear on the traveler's face, the shock in his eyes, the desperate denial that would follow when drugs were planted and accusations rained down. But what the manager considered weakness was actually control. What he mistook for silence was patience, and in his eagerness to humiliate, he was unknowingly walking into his own destruction. Because the man he chose as prey was more powerful than anyone inside that airport, holding an identity that could break the very system the manager manipulated. Yet for now the stage belonged to the manager, and he relished it, convinced that revenge against his chosen target would be swift and satisfying, unaware that the true revenge would soon belong to the traveler. And the story of social injustice he thought he controlled was only the beginning of a twist that would turn his arrogance into the very rope that dragged him down in front of the same crowd he hoped to impress. The moment the manager gave his subtle signal, two security officers stepped forward and blocked the traveler's path, their sudden movement drawing the attention of people nearby. The air around the terminal shifted as curiosity turned into suspicion, and within seconds a sense of unease spread through the crowd. The traveler paused, his calm eyes meeting theirs, but he did not resist. He simply stood still, as one of the officers demanded to see his bag. The manager watched from a distance, his smirk curling as though he was directing a play he had written 100 times before. The bag was opened slowly, deliberately, as though every second of suspense was being stretched for the audience. Then came the gasp, the so-called discovery. Packets carefully placed inside, shining under the harsh lights of the hall. Whispers broke out. People pointed fingers. Phones rose into the air recording the scene. And in those recordings, the manager believed his triumph was immortalized. But the silence of the traveler unsettled more than a few. For while most accused men would cry, shout, or beg, he only stood there, watching with a composure that looked almost unnatural, almost dangerous. The officers searched further, pretending to act with duty, but every gesture was staged, every look rehearsed. The manager folded his arms proudly, soaking in the drama he had created, convinced he had just turned an innocent man into a criminal before hundreds of witnesses. The injustice was clear, yet hidden under layers of authority. The traveler was given no voice, no chance to explain, only judgment thrown upon him like a heavy stone, and still he did not break, still he did not beg. His silence now more piercing than words, a silence that made a few in the crowd uneasy, as though they sensed there was more to this story than what appeared. But the manager dismissed such thoughts, for arrogance blinds the powerful, and he believed his plan was flawless. He believed the traveler's dignity would be crushed, and his reputation would grow. Yet in truth he had lit the fuse of his own destruction. Because every second the traveler remained calm, every breath he took without fear, only deepened the suspense of what was coming next. And while the crowd thought they were witnessing the downfall of a man accused of crime, they were unknowingly standing at the edge of a greater revelation, one that would reverse every accusation, one that would strip the mask from the manager's face, and as the officers held the bag high, showing the planted evidence as proof of guilt, the traveler's steady gaze lingered. Not on them, not on the crowd, but directly on the manager. And in that gaze rested the quiet promise of revenge that was soon to unfold in a way no one inside that airport would ever forget. The hall swelled with noise as the officers held up the planted packets like trophies, and within moments a wide circle of onlookers formed, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and cruel excitement. Dozens of phones were raised to capture the scene, and with every click of a camera the traveler's humiliation grew heavier. Though he remained silent, his stillness became fuel for judgment, because silence in such moments is often mistaken for guilt. People whispered words of shame, calling him a smuggler, a disgrace, a danger to others. None of them stopping to ask whether the story made sense. None of them daring to question the authority of the manager, who now stood tall with his arms crossed, enjoying the scene like a king watching a man dragged into the dirt. He believed his power was absolute, that the crowd's blind faith in authority would protect him from any suspicion. And for the moment he was right. For every insult hurled at the traveler echoed louder than any truth. The injustice burned like fire, stripping the man of his dignity, while the real criminal wore a polished smile. The officers tightened their grip on the traveler's arm, pushing him harshly, forcing him to bow under pressure. And though the pain was real, the humiliation deeper, he did not resist. He let the scene play out, his silence now haunting in its intensity, a silence that unsettled a few who dared to look closer. Because if this man was guilty, why did he look so calm, so unbroken? Yet those faint doubts drowned under the roar of condemnation. As people enjoyed the downfall of a stranger without knowing they were watching a performance designed by a corrupt hand, the traveler's innocence was buried beneath the weight of instant judgment, and the social injustice unfolded raw and merciless. Proving how quickly society accepts appearances as truth when authority points the finger, the manager felt untouchable. He walked a few steps closer, savoring the sight of the traveler's disgrace, his lips curled into a smile of satisfaction, his pride swelling with every cheer, every whisper that confirmed his false victory. Yet hidden behind the traveler's quiet eyes was a storm building steadily, unseen by the crowd, unknown to the officers, but waiting for the perfect moment to erupt. For injustice may shine briefly, but truth carries a power that can shatter illusions in a single second. And as the crowd condemned an innocent man without giving him the dignity of a voice, they were unknowingly placing themselves in the audience of a drama that would soon turn upside down. Because the very silence they mocked was not weakness, but the calm before a revelation that would expose corruption, destroy arrogance, and reverse the roles so completely that the manager's untouchable pride would collapse in front of the same people who now applauded his false authority. The traveler stood in the center of the chaos, his wrists gripped tightly by the officers, the planted evidence still displayed before the watching crowd, and yet his face showed no fear, no panic. No desperate attempt to clear his name. Instead, his eyes remained sharp, fixed not on the people who insulted him, but on the manager who had orchestrated the entire scene. A steady gaze that cut through the false power like a blade. And though the crowd mistook his silence for weakness, there was a weight in that silence that unsettled the few who noticed. Because silence in the face of humiliation can sometimes be louder than the loudest cries of protest. The manager, however, misread this calmness as defeat. Believing the man had accepted his fate, and with arrogance swelling in his chest, he basked in the illusion of victory. But the traveler's quietness was not surrender, it was patience. The patience of a man who understood that truth does not need to scream to be heard. The patience of a man who knew that injustice always digs its own grave. And while the crowd demanded shame, filming his downfall with eager hands, the traveler's eyes spoke of something else entirely. A promise of balance, a warning that this story was not yet finished. His resistance was not in words or gestures, but in the refusal to let their judgment break his spirit. His dignity remained intact, even as his name was dragged through the mud. And in that strength lay a suspense that none of them could recognize. For what kind of guilty man holds his head high in silence while the world condemns him? The tension grew heavier with every second of his stillness. Some in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that something about this scene did not add up. But the manager ignored the small ripples of doubt, confident that the silence meant victory was his. Yet what he did not realize was that the traveler's calmness was not the end of the story, but the beginning of his own downfall. The very silence he mocked would soon echo louder than every accusation. For hidden behind that composed face was a truth powerful enough to collapse the walls of arrogance that surrounded the manager. And as the traveler stood there, his sharp eyes refusing to bow to lies, his silent resistance became the seed of a revelation that would not only free him from the chains of injustice, but also turn the stage against the very man who thought himself untouchable. The silence stretched long enough to make the crowd restless. And just when the humiliation seemed complete, the traveler slowly raised his hand, not to resist, not to plead, but with a calmness so controlled that even the officers holding him paused for a second, their grip tightening as though they feared something was about to change. The crowd leaned in, whispers circling like waves. Then with deliberate precision he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather case. His movements measured, unhurried, confident. The case snapped open and the flash of an official badge caught the harsh airport lights. The hall fell into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People lowered their phones in disbelief. What they saw was not the identity of a criminal, but the authority of a man whose power was greater than the manager's. He was not a random traveler, not an easy target, but the aviation inspector himself, the very figure assigned in secret to test the honesty and discipline of the airport staff. And in that instant, the entire performance collapsed. The hunter revealed himself as the prey. The crowd's judgment dissolved into shock, their whispers transforming from insults into awe. The officers who had gripped him so tightly loosened their hold as fear replaced confidence, their eyes darting toward the manager whose smirk had vanished like smoke. The inspector stood taller now, his silence finally broken, not with words, but with the undeniable weight of truth. And while the planted evidence still lay on display, its meaning had shifted completely. No longer proof of guilt, but proof of corruption. The manager's arrogance cracked under the pressure of exposed reality, his pride trembling as the ground beneath him gave way, for the very man he had tried to disgrace was the authority who held the power to dismantle everything he had built. And the crowd who once joined in humiliation now stared at him with suspicion, realizing they had been part of a cruel injustice. The inspector's eyes never left the manager, steady, sharp, carrying the weight of vengeance not shouted but delivered through truth itself. The power had shifted in a single moment, the story rewritten before everyone's eyes, and while the inspector did not raise his voice, the silence that followed his revelation thundered louder than any accusation, a silence that made the guilty tremble, for it was the silence of justice about to strike. The badge gleamed in the inspector's hand like a blade slicing through lies, and the weight of silence crushed the hall until the sound of shifting feet and uneasy murmurs filled the air. The officers who only moments ago had dragged the traveler now stepped back in shock, their grips falling away as realization sank in, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, their eyes turned toward the manager, the man who had orchestrated the trap, his smirk gone, his lips pressed tight, his face pale as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. For the first time in years, fear crept into his chest, the fear of losing the power he believed unshakable. The inspector closed the badge with deliberate calm, and in a voice steady and sharp, declared that an immediate investigation would begin. His words cut like steel through the tension, and suddenly the officers straightened their stance. No longer allies of the manager, but loyal to the higher authority standing before them. The shift of power was absolute. The authority that once protected the manager now stripped him bare, leaving him exposed to the very justice he had mocked. The crowd that once cheered his false victory now stared at him with contempt, some recording every moment with renewed interest. Because now the story was no longer about a criminal caught, but about a corrupt leader falling. The inspector did not shout. He did not rage. His revenge came in the form of dignity, patience, and unshakable control. And that quiet strength was more terrifying than fury. The manager tried to speak, stammering excuses, his arrogance crumbling into desperation, but every word sounded weak, hollow, and every attempt to defend himself only deepened the hole he had dug. The officers moved closer to him now, their grips once firm on the inspector now redirecting toward the man who had abused their loyalty. And in that sight, the true balance of justice returned. The hunter had become the hunted, the predator exposed as prey before the very people he sought to impress. And as the inspector watched without flinching, the moment of revenge unfolded not through violence but through truth, pure and undeniable. The kind of truth that destroys arrogance more completely than any punishment. The manager's pride shattered in front of everyone, his authority gone, his name stained, and all he could feel was the suffocating weight of fear as he realized the power he thought eternal had been torn from him in an instant. The inspector's calm presence dominated the hall, and though his words were few, their echo was unstoppable. Justice had arrived, sharp and merciless, and nothing the manager did could save him from the collapse of everything he once believed untouchable. The officers moved with sudden certainty, their hands gripping the manager's arms as the crowd erupted into a storm of whispers, disbelief rippling across the terminal like a wave. And the man who once commanded respect now stumbled under the weight of his own downfall, his polished shoes scraping against the floor that moments earlier he had walked upon with arrogance. His empire of lies collapsing in plain sight before the very people who had cheered his false authority. Phones remained raised, but this time they were not capturing the shame of an innocent man. They were recording the humiliation of the guilty, every second of his escort becoming evidence of justice reversing itself. And through it all the inspector stood unmoving, his silence heavier than any outburst, for he knew words were no longer needed. The truth had already spoken louder than accusations. The crowd's eyes shifted toward him with a mix of awe and guilt, some ashamed of their quick judgment, others struck by the power of dignity. Yet no one dared to speak. The air was thick with suspense, as though everyone waited for the inspector to reveal more, to strike harder. But he remained still, his calm gaze following the manager's trembling figure being dragged away. And that silence was more frightening than rage, because silence leaves space for imagination, for questions that cut deeper than answers. What punishment awaited the corrupt manager? What secrets of his past would be uncovered? How many others had fallen victim to his schemes? The suspense lingered in every corner of the airport, wrapping the crowd in unease. The inspector's silence had become his greatest weapon, not by accident but by choice. For silence commands respect when it carries the weight of justice. And in that moment it shook the entire airport to its core. The authority of corruption had shattered. The illusion of power had burned away, and what remained was a warning that no lie, no arrogance, no injustice could stand forever. The inspector turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the hall once more before he walked away, leaving the crowd frozen in thought. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. The tables had turned completely, and the memory of this day would remain etched in every witness. A story of revenge not carried out through anger, but through truth. A story of injustice reversed in the most shocking twist. And a story that ended not with noise but with silence that spoke louder than anything else. The airport slowly returned to motion, but the weight of what had unfolded lingered heavy in the minds of every witness. For they had seen how easily power could be abused, how quickly society could turn against an innocent man, and how arrogance could blind even those who believed themselves untouchable. Yet they had also seen the strength of silence, the force of patience, and the unstoppable strike of truth. The manager who once walked with pride was now remembered only as a symbol of corruption, dragged out before the same people who once admired him, while the inspector, who never raised his voice, left behind a memory far more powerful than words, a lesson carved deep into the moment, reminding all that injustice may shine for a while, but it cannot survive the light of truth. And no matter how strong lies appear, justice always waits for the right moment to reveal itself.